Exactly 23 minutes after 10 o'clock. This is ENCA. Dan Moyane, thanks for joining us on this Friday morning. Now, scores of demonstrators gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington to remember slain African-American George Floyd. Floyd died at the hands of a white police officer in Minneapolis. In video footage, former police officer Derek Chauvin is seen pressing his knee on Floyd's throat while he's struggling to breathe. His death has sparked a wave of protests and riots in American cities. Crowds took to the streets again across the country for the 9th night. Prosecutors have since charged all the 4 officers involved in Floyd's death. Now, his family is saying that it is grateful to everyone around the world who's showing them support. His brother has described George Floyd as a loving sibling and a responsible man.
We feel that love in your city, and thankfully everybody and plus around the world. It's a beautiful thing, this great love we're receiving, and George Floyd is receiving, because he would love it. I wish he was here in the presence, in the flesh, to see it, because all this great unity, he would bring in the tears like it's bringing us. But she had fun, me and my brother, Big Floyd, as y'all know. Oh, cooking-wise, he would make me, honestly, him and the other brothers, 3 gentlemen my brother mentioned grew up in our house, so they would say, "Little bro, you make the best grilled cheese. Can you please go make us one?" I mean, if I tell y'all as a little 6 or 7-year-old kid, I did that numerous times. I realized as I got older, y'all just using me. but you know, I was just happy to be doing it. But my big brother, I mean, great guy, great gentleman, great man, and as a child, without no father figure, he was big brother, but I didn't see the little stuff that he was throwing out. He was doing the best he can, and the mistakes he made, and I, watching them follow him, corrected myself as a grown man, as a teenager growing up, and, you know, learning from him how to be a man, and everything he instilled us and taught us. He was doing him, but he was teaching us how to be a man, because he was in this world already before us. And he gave us a lot of great lessons. And I mean, one thing about a man, keep the definition as is, Floyd, responsibility. He would stand up for his family and friends, and he's great at that. And I want you guys to know that he would stand up for any injustice.
Well, U.S. civil rights activist, the Reverend Sharpton, says the police responsible for Floyd's death should be held accountable. The 4 former police officers have made their first appearance in court. Sharpton has condemned those who focus on the looting during the protests in the United States. He says the majority of protesters didn't loot, and those who did should be brought to book.
Some of y'all don't want peace. You just want quiet. You just want us to shut up and suffer in silence. The overwhelming majority of the people marching wasn't breaking windows. They were trying to break barriers. They wasn't trying to steal nothing. They were trying to get back the justice you stole from us. Those that broke the law should pay for whatever law they broke, but so should the 4 policemen that caused this funeral today. We don't have a problem denouncing violence, Mr. Governor. We don't have a problem, Mr. Mayor, denouncing looting. But it seems like some in the criminal justice system have a problem looking at a tape and knowing there's probable cause, and it takes a long time for you to go and do what you see that you need to do.
Okay, now let's continue our discussion on ENCA this morning with Judge Navi Pillay, former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Khadija Bawa, a researcher for the Social Justice Coalition, and the Reverend Dennis Dillion, one of New York's most influential black leaders. And we'll also be getting views shortly of South African Abang Mokhase, who lives in Baltimore in the United States. For this segment, let me start with you, Reverend Dillion, just on the back of what Reverend Sharpton was saying there in that clip we've just played, that they are the way he's saying that prosecutors seem to be dragging their feet. Is there a sense now that all the police officers involved in the death of George Floyd have now been charged? Is there a sense now that there's going to be progress in trying them?
It is a tense sense. The fact of the matter is we've seen in previous cases. The fact of the matter, when the whole theme, I Can't Breathe, didn't start with George Floyd. It actually started going back here in New York, in Staten Island, with Gardner. And the fact of the matter is, to this very day, that police officer that choked him and held him until he died has not been properly prosecuted by the prosecutory system here in New York City. And we've waited for federal charges, and we failed to get them. The acquittal of, if we go back to Rodney King in L.A., those officers, we saw the video, we saw the beating, we saw his face bruised and battered, and he almost died. They were acquitted. So this is only the first step in the system of justice in these United States. And the fact of the matter, I'm praying and hoping that that will not be our outcome. But being charged is the first step in that right direction. But being found guilty is the difficult journey ahead that the Attorney General spoke to. He spoke with great apprehension that we have a difficult road ahead. And one of the reasons why charges start so low, particularly with police officers when they kill black people in these United States of America, the charges are generally low because it is more likely to win a conviction on a low charge than it does on a second-degree or a first-degree murder charge, which is really what is due in cases like this. So we're just going to have to watch and see what happens. But I also think we have to deal with the fact that classism, which is largely what it might be viewed as in South Africa, is largely racism in these United States of America, because at the end of the day, it comes down to who owns and who does not own, who control and who does not control. I just want to make a very quick point that when we look at the history of what black folks have gone through, at one point we couldn't own a cow because if we own a cow, we could feed ourselves. We couldn't own guns because if we own guns, we could protect ourselves. We couldn't own horses because if we own horses, they think we would run away. We couldn't own land because we would economically empower ourselves, and we could not learn to read. It was against the law for black people to learn to read because we would have knowledge. We're still dealing with some of those historic issues.
Reverend Dillion, the other point I want to raise now is some commentators in America, like former US President Barack Obama, have mentioned that what has happened and what is happening currently is an opportunity for change, and he believes young people would be at the forefront of that. Let's take a listen to this clip from the former US President Barack Obama.
There is a change in mindset that's taking place, a greater recognition that we can do better. And that is not as a consequence of speeches by politicians. That's not the result of, spotlights in news articles. That's a direct result of the activities and organizing and mobilization and engagement of so many young people across the country who put themselves out on the line to make a difference. And so I just have to say thank you to them and for helping to bring about this moment.
There's Barack Obama there thanking the people who are protesting for bringing about this as an opportunity for change. Are you as hopeful and as positive about this opportunity for change, Reverend Dillion, on the ground in the U.S.?
Yeah, I am very optimistic about it. I think one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement happened to be a spiritual daughter of mine. And I've seen how these young people have really organized, these young people, as much as they're continuing the tradition of the demonstrations and the marches, they recognize that there obviously has to be so much more. We've been out at some of the marches and demonstration, and we're just energized just seeing the youthful zest and energy, and knowing that our young people want more. Another of my spiritual sons just organized a demonstration in North New Jersey and organized all of his peers. So yes, there is there is hope because the young people are in the forefront. I think what we have to charge and challenge and encourage them to do, because yes, I believe very strongly that we will never ever get to equality in America through demonstrations, through marches. We will get there through economic sanction. We will get there through economic potency. We will get there through owning our communities. At the end of the day, we have to own our communities. It was a merchant that called the police against Eric Garner in Staten Island. It was a merchant that called the police against George Floyd in Minneapolis. And at the end of the day, until we Black people become those merchants in our own communities, we will really not solve this very difficult situation we're dealing with.
Now, let's come home here in South Africa. Khadija, I want to bring you here because one of the points you are making is the fact that we need to demand justice, for example, for Collins Khosa. Why do you think is there little outrage over police brutality and violence in our country compared to what we are seeing playing itself out in America following the death of George Floyd?
So I think that in America, this has been a long time coming, like the Reverend has said, right? So the Black Lives Matter movement was established formally in 2013 and preceded a long history to that. But I think it's also very disingenuous to say that police brutality hasn't been protested for in South Africa. If you have any community organized group or any protest led in South Africa for basic municipal services, fees must fall against the Marikana massacre, any of those things were met with police brutality. Last year in August, we saw the country come to a standstill for anti-gender-based violence. And even then, the women and non-binary people and the queer community that were protesting violence against us was also met with police brutality. So there has been an outcry against police brutality from civil society, from communities in South Africa. It might not be at the level where Black Lives Matter is, but it is prevalent in South Africa and it is being called on. It is just really sad and very devastating that when this does happen, the media especially focuses on one specific case. And even then, we have Collins Khosa being everywhere, and we are demanding justice for Collins Khosa, but there's very little attention being put on the South African National Defence Force officers who committed the violence that led to his death. So I think there's a shift that is needed. One is to say that South Africans have been contesting police brutality for a very, very, very long time. And the other is to say that when we talk about collectively in the media, especially when we talk about police brutality, we have to focus on the officers that are committing these violence instead of the victims that died needlessly.
Now, Judge Pillay, at the start of our discussion, you mentioned that at a World Human Rights Conference held in Durban, there was a plan of action that was outlined, and if it was implemented, maybe wouldn't be seeing so much law enforcement brutality. Is South Africa implementing that plan according to from what you know?
Well, let me first say, you see the message from Floyd's brother. What is he telling us? He's saying Floyd was a human being. He was an individual. Every individual has the right to life, the right to dignity. President Obama, former President Obama, speaks about the solidarity of civil society. Let me assure you, Dan, no major change has happened in the international sphere. Every progressive, protective resolution in the GA was adopted because of civil society pressure. I also want to say that the level of brutality, police brutality in the United States is so shocking. This is why there has been global protests about that violence and that many governments have also spoken out. So it's very similar to the apartheid-era violence against black people in our country. In 2001, the World Conference, the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerances was held right here in Durban. And of course, 10 years on, I was the High Commissioner and was the Secretariat for the Review Committee. And you should have seen the level of political alliances that built up, with the United States protecting Israel, boycotting these conferences. You will recall that Colin Powell led the U.S. representatives out of the Durban meeting. So when I became High Commissioner, it was shocking to me that the word Durban became a really bad word. A U.S. ambassador, they were about to vote on the entire budget of the United Nations, and he called me and he said, all right, if you remove the word Durban from your report, then we won't vote against the budget.
So there was resistance.
And I said to him,
Judge
yeah,
Navi
would
Pillay.
you like me to remove
Judge
the
Pillay.
word piano?
Yeah, sorry, Judge Pillay. So seemingly there
Yeah.
was reluctance and there was resistance to implement it. We're going to be saying goodbye now to you, Reverend Dillion, and thank you very much for having stayed up so late in New York to talk to us, because as we continue our discussion, I want to bring a South African who lives in Baltimore. But very briefly, Reverend Dillion, before you go, and I will put this question as well to Judge Navi Pillay and Khadija Bawa later on. How do you respond to what we've seen in social media as well, and people saying it's not just about Black Lives Matter, it's also all lives matter?
I totally disagree with that perception and sense. I agree with the statement that all lives matter. All lives do matter. There's no question about that. But the reality that we're dealing with is the pervasive actions and activities that we find, particularly in government circles, in law enforcement circles, where Black lives are disrespected, Black lives are disregarded, Black lives are being brutalized and are being killed all across the United States of America. And we're now just talking about law enforcement, but we could look at various layers of this. So the fact that the issue of Black lives are being raised is a relevant issue, because when we look at the history of this country, it is systematic, it is symptomatic, it is in every sense of the word. Black lives have been disrespected and disregarded, from the fact that Black lives were being thrown overboard when ships were in difficulties, on the Atlantic on its way to these United States of America. So the fact that Black lives have been disrespected, it is appropriate and correct for us to deal with the fact that as other lives have experienced respect and dignity, Black lives do matter and should have the same level of respect and dignity. And that has to be a message that everybody got to see and understand. So for right now, when George Floyd is the one that is being killed, in broad daylight, choked to death with a knee on his neck for almost 9 minutes, it is a matter of Black lives, and Black lives do matter.
Reverend Dillion, thank you very much for your time this evening, and we'll let you go for now, but we'll continue our discussion with Judge Navi Pillay.
It's my pleasure. God bless you. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you very much, and our condolences to you as well and fellow Black Americans at this time. And we'll continue as well with researcher Khadija Bawa, and we'll be joined by South African Abangu Khase, who lives in Baltimore, as we proceed shortly. Stay with us.